I'm very happy today to introduce to you Jessica Cording. She is a registered dietitian, health coach, and author who helps people build sustainable health habits by connecting nutrition, lifestyle, and mental health. She is the author of 2 books for caregivers, which I'll mention later. In addition, she also produces the Drama Free Healthy Living podcast. That sounds interesting to me, drama free. And she speaks to organizations about sustainable, healthy living. That's quite a list of support for caregivers. Tell me, Jessica, how did this journey begin for you as a caregiver?
Yeah, I guess, and I've been in the healthcare field for almost 15 years to date since, today we're talking. I remember when I was early in my career as a dietitian. I'm a registered dietitian, by training. And one of my earliest roles was as a dietitian in an ALS clinic. And I remember seeing the wear and tear that my patients and their families went through because ALS, it's a diagnosis that going into it, it's going to be a long road. And I just remember thinking, like, wow, like I wish we had more support to offer not just the patients themselves, but their families and their caregivers, whether that's family caregivers, friends who are caring for them, people who work professionally as caregivers. And I also remember thinking, well, given my experience in healthcare, if my own loved one ever became ill, I'll know what to do. And I found out a few years later when I was 31 and my father was diagnosed with advanced pancreatic cancer. I found out how wrong I was about that. Honestly, it is so different when it's your own family member. Because, yes, there's some of the nuts and bolts things, like the more practical aspects of caregiving for which you might be better equipped for. But emotionally, there was a lot that I had to learn. So I found that, especially as someone who's a younger caregiver, my mother, my sister, and I all chipped in, but I turned my whole life upside down. I changed my professional life, my social life changed drastically, and I just found that there were not a lot of resources forget caregivers in general. I had a hard time finding them at all, but especially for younger caregivers, I really couldn't find much out there that spoke to me. So, it was kind of piecing it all together. And ultimately, I decided to eventually write several, resources to help caregivers because I wanted the resources that I couldn't find for myself or for my patients' families.
There's not a playbook when you're called on to be a caregiver in your 20s or early 30s. It's not anything that you expect or prepared for. Is
Yeah.
there anything in particular you wish you had known ahead of time?
Oh, well, the fact that alcohol is incredibly disruptive to sleep. That's probably the real answer. But no, I wish that I had known some of the things about just how to pace yourself. One of the things that I did to be able to have the time to care for my dad was that I quit my clinical job. I, at that time, was working per diem in a major hospital in New York City. I also had a number of other jobs that I was doing and income stream as a writer and a speaker. So I kind of I dove into that, and it was really a lot to be learning about how to build a business while also caring for a family member. And and it's at a time too. I was 31. Like a lot of my friends were coupling off and getting married, and I was trying to do my best in all realms, but I had a really hard time figuring out what to prioritize in my life outside of caregiving. I remember that was a struggle, and it was a lot of stress. And a lot of my work that I do today, almost a decade later, is so focused on stress management, and a lot of that comes from the fact that I struggled a lot in that department.
I can't even imagine the steep learning curve of learning how to emotionally handle caring for your father and learning how to build a business to replace your former income. You mentioned experiencing a total change in priorities. You just mentioned that. Can you expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I I had definitely, prior to my dad's diagnosis, I had been very focused on work. Um, you know, I joke in my second book, The Farewell Tour, I joke about the fact that, people, when they found out that I was living and working and writing in New York City, they'd say, oh, it's just like Sex in the City. And my response to that was like, yeah, sure, if Carrie Bradshaw wore a lab coat and orthotics. And the thing is, though, I hadn't so much as been on a date in a year, like at the time my dad was diagnosed. Like I was not, that time in my life, it was not like Sex in the City. It was all work all the time. I
Yeah.
never saw my family. And when my dad was diagnosed, it really did show me, we don't know how much time we have with the people that we love. And it was a really easy decision to make more time for my family and to prioritize that. But I learned that I didn't know how. I didn't know how to slow down. I didn't know how to be present. And that was another part of the learning curve, a really important part. But it showed me that I'd had my priorities all wrong. I thought that if I just worked my face off and was successful enough that I would somehow be safe from I don't know what. We could definitely tie that to old trauma response or, coping mechanisms that we learn along the way. But it was certainly a wake-up call that it's not all about work.
So you pretty much turned your life upside down at that point so that you could be there for your dad. What kind of toll did the stress and lack of sleep have on your health?
So I found that the sleep deprivation, I noticed it the most with my immune system. That was the first way that it showed up. And I found, for example, my sister got married that September. She was going to get married in May, but my father's doctor suggested that they move the wedding up. So we learned that you can plan a wedding in less than 2 months. It can be done if you're willing to pay for things.
Uh-huh.
I remember I got a terrible infection from the manicure that I got at her wedding, and it got so bad it was like it was resistant to multiple types of antibiotics. I had to get the nail removed. I even there's a part in the book where I talk about I had ended up having an allergic reaction to one of the antibiotics I tried, and I was so checked out of my own body, me, a healthcare professional who helped other people tune into their bodies. I was so checked out because I was so focused on my dad and getting him to chemo and managing his side effects and look what's going on with his labs that I didn't see all the warning signs that my own body was showing me. And I thought I was having an eczema outbreak. It got so bad, I ended up, my throat and my face started to swell. I ended up having to get an emergency shot of Benadryl and like sent home on a course of steroids. And I just remember lying there in the middle of the night thinking like, wow, like if I had not, done something, if I got so desperate and so itchy, I finally went and got sought care. If I just tried to sleep it off and gaslight myself the way so many women do, that it's possible that I wouldn't have made it, that it would have eventually made its way through my system because, I was trying to be a good girl, take the medication, like follow the instructions. And that was, I realized, wow, okay, I'm doing a terrible job of managing my stress because sleep and stress are so connected. And, sure, like my dad needed me to be there for him and do things, but I was of much less use to him if I were dead. So that was an important message to get that I needed to focus more on managing the stress that was affecting my sleep. So I will say that immune system piece definitely is what I noticed the loudest. And then of course the brain fog,
Mhm.
um, low energy. I would fall asleep meditating. That a lot of things just I felt not myself and less capable. That was really hard.
I think many of us in the holistic professions end up having to take our own medicine in
Oh
one
yes.
way or another, learn the lessons that we're dishing out. As a dietitian, you no doubt focused on diet and exercise, but tell me what journaling did for your mental health.
That honestly, sometimes I feel like that saved me. I had at that time, I go through phases with my journaling structure, we'll say, but a habit I've had in place since I was 19, when I first read The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron, I've been in the habit of writing morning pages, whether it's the 3 pages that she recommends or whether it's some during busy seasons of my life, it's like a page, anything, but I have to get pen to paper sometime in the morning just however it needs to happen, it happens. But at that time, I would do kind of structured check-ins with myself. Like, these are some things I'm grateful for. This is something that went well today. This is something I'm working on. And during the days when it was really challenging with my dad, where I was feeling really down and hopeless, I was able to at least glean like one thing that made me smile that day, or one bright spot, and that was really valuable at that time.
I've journaled for years and it saved my life as well. You mentioned the role of dark humor with your dad. Not everyone can laugh at dark humor, but what did dark humor do for your relationship with your father?
Oh gosh, that was something we connected on. Like if we were at an event, like some family event where everyone was being all serious, like he and I would be like cracking up in the back, and I think it helped us feel normal. My dad was a really funny guy, and the way that his friends and colleagues remember him to me is that he had an irreverent sense of humor and was always a straight shooter and really honest. And I think for him, just being able to still make those dark jokes on his terms. I think that was really helpful for him and for all of us. And honestly, his humor kept us going a lot of the time.
I think it must mean a lot to not be treated like you're dying.
Exactly.
Your dad said, and I quote, "Once they know you're dying, everyone wants a piece of you." What did he mean by that?
Oh my goodness. Well, so my dad worked in the music industry. He was on the promotion side for a very long time. Worked with many, many different artists, different labels, most of his time at Columbia Records. So we grew up listening to a lot of Columbia artists in the house. But what I will say is he had that experience of, the behind the scenes of the what it's like, managing and supporting artists on the road from that that perspective and just how grueling that is on the performer and all of the people involved in caring for them. I mean, that's where I got the title and the theme for the book, The Farewell Tour, because that's what my dad ended up calling the last months of his life. It was sort of his dark way of joking about what he was going through. And he held off for a long time on letting people know that he was sick because he didn't want all the phone calls and the people wanting to come see him. He just wanted to live his life on his terms. So that was I remember that moment when he said that. He just kind of like chuckled about it. It was like, it's like the farewell tour. Like that's why we called it that. And that's why I ended up calling the book that, because it was just kind of a little joke that helped us all cope through it.
Tell us the title again.
So the full title is The Farewell Tour, A Caregiver's Guide to Stress Management, Sane Nutrition, and Better Sleep.
Great, great title. I I honor your dad for that great title. You listed five very simple, practical choices that relieved the chores around caregiving. What were two of your favorites?
Oh gosh, it's so hard to pick a favorite, right? But I think one thing that I think was really important is one that's just a practical one that I think a lot of people struggle with is not being afraid to ask for help and support and not being afraid to receive that support. I think there is this thing that happens when you're in a caregiving role where you feel like you have to do as much as possible and you have to do it correctly. Of course, you're going to get so many things wrong, and you have to be kind to yourself when that happens. All you can do is your best. But I think the more specific we can be when we ask for help, that's also helpful for those who want to help us. We all know those people that will say, I'm here if you need me. But then that puts the pressure on the caregiver who needs support to have to ask for that. So, what I would say is if you are the caregiver and if there are areas that you identified you need help with, like for me, I think if I could have just paid someone to come to my apartment once a month and like freaking vacuum my floor, like that would have been really helpful. Or like I was doing a lot of the cooking for my family during my dad's illness. So like if I had found myself not able to do that, maybe that would have been a place where leaning into some healthy shortcuts or asking a friend or family member to help with some grocery shopping or getting groceries delivered, like that can count as help too. I think any, or even if it's like something that comes up with sometimes with my older patients and clients or people I'm working with who are caregivers and they're having issues with the technology side of things. Like so many of these different healthcare institutions use like patient portals, and for some people who may not be comfortable with the technology, that can be so overwhelming. So if there's someone in your life who is good with tech, and you can ask them to help you figure out that darn patient portal so you can actually access those records and communicate with the team. Like things like that can be really helpful. So that's one thing I would say is a big one. And then second one, I think creating systems is really helpful. So, that caregiver experience, things can feel so out of control. And anything you can do to create some structure, something that is routine can be really helpful. So I know in my family, we did a lot with medication schedules and kind of having a designated spot, having it all written out. So that way it was just, we knew what needed to be given at what time and all these other things that went along with that. If you need to set up reminders to pay bills or, definitely put appointments in the calendar and share it with anybody who needs to see it. But systems that simplify can really help reduce overwhelm when it comes to caregiving.
I used to think that having groceries delivered was a luxury, but there have been a couple times in my life when it was absolutely a necessity and such a big help. And things as simple as vacuuming your apartment, practical jobs, and people want to help, but they don't know what it is you need or when they're going to be in the way. So being very specific about what would be helpful is such a good tip. What have you learned about grieving throughout this journey?
That it's not linear. That's actually probably one of the most valuable things that was shared with me during this journey. I think it was really early on. And it was just helpful to hear that because I think with grief, I know my experience was that I started grieving before my father passed because you're not just grieving the person, and their presence, you're also grieving the loss of normalcy, the loss of the future that you thought you had together. Yes, when they pass, you are grieving them, and that comes up at very strange times. I find for myself, even really happy moments, those sometimes are the hardest because I want to just, like turn to my dad and say, hey, isn't this great? I want to call him and share something with him. And that is something that initially I might have been like, I don't understand. Why is this coming up now? Or if you have a day for whatever reason, something just hits you in a way that gives you that feeling or makes the grief feel more present. I think it's important to know that there's no correct timeline with
Right.
grief, and we have to let ourselves feel and process and do what we need to feel grounded and get through it.
Right. It is not linear and it comes and goes at surprising times. And I've dealt with a lot of grief in my life. And my belief system is that grief never totally goes away. It's like we tuck a piece of that person down in our heart, and certain things to this day will trigger feelings of grief. I love the titles of your book. One of them is The Little Book of Game Changes: 50 Healthy Habits for Managing Stress and Anxiety. Such a great title. And you mentioned before The Farewell Tour: A Caregiver's Guide to Stress Management, Sane Nutrition, and Better Sleep. So, what would you wish you could further do for caregivers? Or do you have any plans for other things that are along this line?
Yeah, I mean, a big thread in all my work is helping people notice connections between their mind and their body and their mental well-being. I think when we take better care of ourselves, we're better able to show up for others. So I'm all about sharing approachable tools that people can utilize in that realm. So I share a lot in my books, but also my podcast and all the content that I share in my writing and my public speaking. And I'm continuing to bring this thread to future projects. If there was a way that we could somehow, this is a bad time to be talking about like public health policy in the United States. But if there was a way that we could
Very
create,
appropriate time to be talking about it.
right, there's a lot of room for improvement. We'll say that. I think everyone can agree on that. And but I would love there to be more support in general for caregivers, whether that is people caring for someone with ongoing health needs or someone with a terminal illness or even parents. Parents are caregivers. We do not provide enough support for parents.
Yes.
But just having resources, whether that's at a national level, regional, local, you know, we're not, as humans, we're not really meant to do all this stuff by ourselves. Like traditionally we have been communities supporting each other and we've gotten really far away from that. And I would love to see more support for caregivers.
You're not the first caregiver I've interviewed who has made the same comment that
But
it's so hard to research and find appropriate support when you are a caregiver. We don't live in small communities anymore, or at least many of us don't. For our viewers today, you can meet Jessica Cording on her website, jessicacordingnutrition.com, as well as other social media sites. Jessica, I really admire you for turning your experience into helping other caregivers, giving them a guide to help them. Is there anything else you want to leave, a message you want to leave in passing?
yeah, I would just remind caregivers that, well, two things. One, you're doing a great job, probably a better job than you think you're doing. And two, you deserve to be cared for as well. Do not forget that. Self-care for caregivers, for anybody, is not selfish. It's essential. So do what you need to do to take care of you.
I love those two words, especially the caregiver needs to take care of themselves without being feeling selfish. Thank you so much for joining me here this morning to kind of recap your article. You can read Jessica's full article on Authority Magazine titled Lessons Learned as a Caregiver. And thank you again. I hope you have a wonderful day, Jessica.
Thank you for having me, Nancy.